There's a particular kind of silence that fills a room when 400 people realize something at the exact same moment. I heard it before I saw it, a soft collective intake of breath, the rustle of programs going still in laps, a hush spreading backward from the front row like a wave running out of water. I didn't need to turn around. I already knew what everyone was looking at. The chair beside mine, empty. My name is Eleanor Voss, and I had spent 35 years walking the same concrete floor at Whitmore Fabrication before anyone thought to put a bow on it and call it a celebration. I wasn't a woman who needed fanfare. I'd told the events coordinator as much 3 separate times. A cake in the break room would have suited me fine, but Whitmore had grown into one of the largest employers in this stretch of Pennsylvania, and apparently that meant I no longer got to decide how my own gratitude was packaged. So there I sat in a rented blue dress at the front of a hotel ballroom in Allentown, watching a slideshow of my own life flicker across 3 screens the size of garage doors, and trying very hard not to look at the reserved card sitting on the empty seat to my right. Claire Voss Hayes and family, it read, in gold script someone had clearly spent real money on. I'd asked for exactly one thing from my daughter this year. One afternoon. I hadn't asked her to fly in for Christmas, hadn't asked for a birthday call that lasted longer than 4 minutes, hadn't asked her to remember that her father's anniversary fell in October, and always would. Just this, 2 hours, a folding chair, and her presence while a company handed me a piece of engraved glass for 3.5 decades of showing up. She'd said yes 6 weeks ago. She'd said yes again 2 weeks ago when I called to confirm the time. She had not said yes this morning when I sat in my car in the hotel parking lot and watched in real time a photo load onto her Instagram, her and Todd standing on a white sand beach somewhere warm, cocktails sweating in the sun, the caption reading something about finally saying yes to ourselves. A sponsored trip, free flights, free rooms, free everything, in exchange for smiling at a camera for a company that sold overpriced swimwear. I hadn't cried in that parking lot. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories are supposed to go. The wounded mother weeping into a steering wheel. That wasn't what happened. What happened was quieter, and in its way worse. I simply sat there for a long moment, feeling something settle inside my chest like a stone, finding the bottom of a lake. Then I fixed my lipstick in the visor mirror and walked inside, because 35 years teaches you that the floor doesn't stop moving just because your heart has. The events coordinator, a kind young woman named Priya, had noticed the empty chair before the ceremony even started. She'd crouched beside me, voice low. "Mrs. Voss, would you like us to hold the start? Give your daughter a little more time?" "No," I said. "She's not coming." Priya's face did something complicated, sympathy fighting against professionalism. "Would you like someone to sit with you?" "We could ask one of the executives." I was already shaking my head before she finished. My eyes had drifted, without my permission, to the back of the ballroom, where a young woman in a borrowed-looking navy blazer stood near the door, clutching a small gift bag like it might be confiscated. Marisol. She hadn't been invited. Not officially. I'd mentioned the ceremony to her almost apologetically 2 weeks earlier. The way you mention something you don't expect anyone to actually show up for. And yet there she was, 28 years old, dark hair pulled back the same practical way her mother used to wear hers, standing at the back of a room full of strangers because I'd said the word ceremony once, in passing, over coffee. Her, I told Priya, and lifted a hand. "Marisol, would you come sit with me?" The look on Marisol's face when 400 heads turned toward her was somewhere between panic and disbelief. She mouthed the word me? Across the room. I nodded. She walked down that aisle like the floor might give way beneath her, smoothing the front of her blazer twice before she reached the front row. "Your mother would be sitting there if she still could," I said quietly, once she'd lowered herself into the chair. "So it's yours today." Her eyes filled instantly. "I wouldn't have missed this," she whispered. "Not for anything." 4 words. That was all it took for me to understand, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, exactly how far my own daughter had drifted from a truth this simple. Marisol Reyes, a woman who owed me nothing, who had her own rent to pay and her own life to build, had rearranged an entire Saturday for 2 hours in a folding chair. My daughter, who owed me at minimum the courtesy of honesty, had chosen a beach. The lights dimmed before I could sit with that thought any longer. The slideshow began. There I was at 26, hard hat too big for my head, standing on a factory floor that didn't exist anymore. There was my late husband Frank at a company picnic, gone 11 years now, laughing at something off camera. There was Rosa, Marisol's mother, my best friend for 22 years, dead 9 years this spring, captured mid-laugh in a photo I didn't even remember someone taking. I felt Marisol's hand find mine in the dark. And hold on. Neither of us knew yet that within the hour, a company executive would stand at that podium and announce a number that would end up on the local news by dinner time, or that somewhere on a beach 1,100 miles south, my daughter's phone was about to start ringing in a way that would not stop for the rest of the night. I met Rosa Reyes on my second week at Whitmore Fabrication, back when the plant still had a cafeteria that served actual meals instead of vending machines, and back when I was 24 and terrified of every machine on that floor. She caught me staring at the hydraulic press like it might reach out and grab me, and she laughed, not unkindly, and said, "It only bites the people who aren't paying attention. So pay attention." That became the whole shape of our friendship, really. Rosa paying attention so the rest of us didn't have to learn things the hard way. She was 3 years older than me, already married to a man named Hector who fixed trucks for a living, already raising a toddler named Marisol who used to nap in a playpen in the break room on the days the sitter fell through, and nobody said a word about it. Rosa didn't ask permission for things like that. She simply did what needed doing and dared anyone to object. We became the kind of friends who didn't need occasions. Thursday coffee before shift, casseroles left on porches when someone's kid had chicken pox. She was at the hospital the night Claire was born, pacing the waiting room because Frank was stuck on a delayed flight from a business trip, and she was the one who put my newborn daughter in my arms and said, "There, now you're not alone in this." I think about that sentence more than she probably ever intended me to. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March, during a routine line shutdown for maintenance. A pressure valve failed. Nobody's fault, exactly. Just metal fatigue nobody had caught in time, and the release sent a section of scaffolding down onto the floor where I was standing, checking a gauge I had no business checking without backup. I remember the sound more than anything, a shriek of metal that didn't sound like it belonged in a factory at all. Rosa was 15 feet away. She didn't run for the exit. She ran toward me, got both hands on my shoulders, and threw us sideways into the gap beneath the loading dock a half second before 400 pounds of scaffolding came down where I'd been standing. She broke her wrist doing it. I didn't get a scratch. Afterward, when people called her a hero, she'd wave it off with the same irritated shrug every time. Anybody would have done it. I used to argue with her about that, told her not everybody would have, that I certainly wasn't sure I would have, and she'd just roll her eyes and change the subject, because Rosa never could stand being thanked for longer than about 11 seconds. Cancer took her 9 years ago. Ovarian caught late, gone in under a year. I sat with her more nights than I can count, watching a woman who'd never once flinched at a factory floor grow smaller in a hospital bed that seemed too big for her. The last real conversation we had, she gripped my hand with a strength I didn't think she had left and said, "Watch out for my girl." "You know I will," I told her. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not asking twice." Marisol was 19 then, too old to be raised, too young to be entirely on her own, and too proud, like her mother, to accept help when it was offered plainly. She waited tables through community college, moved 3 times chasing cheaper rent, and turned down every check I tried to hand her with the exact same tilt of the chin Rosa used to give me. "I've got it," she'd say. Instead, I learned to help sideways. A mechanic who owed me a favor fixing her car for cost. A friend in HR who made sure her resume didn't disappear into a pile. Casseroles left on a porch because apparently that's simply what the women in this story do for each other. She became a physical therapist eventually, working mostly with elderly patients recovering from falls and surgeries, the kind of job that pays modestly and asks everything of you emotionally. Every year on the anniversary of Rosa's death, she sends me a card. Every year on my birthday, she actually calls and stays on the phone longer than 4 minutes. I didn't marry her mother's memory to some obligation I forced onto her. She simply kept showing up, the way Rosa always had, because that's what Rosa raised. The morning of the ceremony, before I'd even mentioned it to her directly, I'd only referenced it once, almost as an afterthought over coffee 3 weeks earlier. She'd apparently put it on her calendar without telling me, rearranged 2 patients, and driven 40 minutes in traffic to stand at the back of a ballroom she wasn't sure she was allowed to be in. Sitting beside her now, watching Rosa's face flicker across a screen the size of a garage door, I understood something I'd been circling for years without quite landing on it. Blood doesn't obligate anyone to show up. It never has. Rosa showing up for me had nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with the choice she made, over and over for 22 years. Marisol was making that same choice now, and my own daughter, who shared my blood and my house and my last name for 18 years, had chosen a beach instead. The slideshow ended, the lights came up, and Richard Ashford, our CEO, walked toward the podium with a folder under his arm that I hadn't been told to expect. Richard Ashford had run Whitmore Fabrication for 11 years, and in all that time I'd never once seen him nervous at a podium. He adjusted the microphone anyway, the way people do when they need a second to find their footing. "I've worked alongside Eleanor Voss for 11 years, he said, and in that time, I've watched her make the right decision in 100 small moments nobody else was paying attention to. I felt my face warm. This wasn't the kind of attention I knew what to do with. He talked about the winter I'd stayed past midnight during an ice storm, making sure 3 younger line workers had somewhere warm to wait until the roads cleared instead of driving home in whiteout conditions. I'd forgotten I'd even told anyone about that. He talked about the time I'd noticed a temp worker limping through a shift and quietly arranged for the company's medical fund to cover a knee brace nobody thought she could afford. I hadn't told anyone about that at all, which meant somebody had gone looking. "She's turned down 2 supervisor promotions over the years," Richard continued, "both times because the position would have meant relocating, and she didn't want to uproot her daughter's life." A murmur moved through the crowd, the kind of soft, appreciative sound 400 people make when they learn a stranger sacrificed something for a child they'll never meet. I didn't look at the empty chair. I'd promised myself I wouldn't, and mostly I kept that promise, except for the one time a floor camera panned wide, and I caught its reflection in the corner of a screen, that small gold-lettered card still sitting there, untouched, while Marisol's hand stayed warm in mine. One by one, people I'd worked beside for decades stood and told stories I'd half forgotten. A retired supervisor named Walt described how I'd once caught a bookkeeping error that would have shorted 40 employees their holiday bonus and quietly fixed it before anyone above me even knew there'd been a mistake. A woman from payroll, Denise, described the year I'd donated my own bonus without telling a soul to cover a coworker's unexpected medical bill. I remembered doing it. I hadn't remembered it mattering enough for anyone to keep track. That's the strange thing about kindness done quietly for 35 years. You stop counting it yourself. Other people, it turns out, don't. Richard handed me a heavy crystal award engraved with my name and the number 35 beneath it, and the applause that followed went on long enough that I had to look down at my hands just to keep my composure. Somewhere in that applause I heard Priya's voice near the sound booth, low and urgent, talking to someone about the live feed cutting to a wider shot. I didn't think much of it at the time. Then the MC, a warm-voiced woman named Talia, stepped back to the microphone and did something I hadn't rehearsed and hadn't expected. "Eleanor," she said, smiling toward the front row, "we noticed you brought someone very special with you today. Would you tell us about her?" The screen behind her filled with a photo I didn't know existed. Someone had captured Marisol and me sitting together, her hand still in mine from the slideshow. A ripple of soft applause moved through the room, curious and warm. I looked at Marisol. She looked back at me with something between terror and trust, and I understood she was leaving the decision entirely in my hands. "Her name is Marisol Reyes," I said into the small handheld microphone someone passed me. "Her mother, Rosa, worked beside me on this floor for 22 years. I paused, feeling my throat tighten in a way I hadn't expected in front of 400 strangers and 2 television cameras. "Rosa saved my life during an accident on this floor 9 years before she died of cancer. Before she passed, she asked me to look after her daughter. I've tried." The room had gone very quiet. "Marisol didn't have to be here today," I continued. "Nobody asked her to rearrange her schedule or drive 40 minutes across town. She simply showed up, the way her mother always did." I looked at her, and my voice nearly broke on the next part. If anyone deserved to be sitting in the seat that was saved for my own family today, it was her. The ballroom rose to its feet. Not the polite ripple of applause from before, an actual standing ovation, chairs scraping back, people wiping their eyes, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere lower in the chest than ordinary clapping does. I saw Walt, 70-some years old and not a man given to sentiment, dabbing at his eyes with a cocktail napkin. I hadn't meant to say all of that out loud. I certainly hadn't meant for it to be broadcast on the 6 o'clock news, which, as I would learn within the hour, it absolutely was. Richard let the applause settle before leaning back toward the microphone with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between mischief and nerves. "Actually," he said, glancing down at the folder still tucked under his arm, "we have one more announcement. And Eleanor, I should warn you, this one wasn't in the program either." I frowned. Nobody had told me to expect a second surprise. And judging by the flicker of genuine surprise crossing Richard's own face as he opened that folder, I wasn't entirely sure he'd expected to be the one delivering it. Richard cleared his throat and unfolded a single sheet of paper from the folder, and I felt a strange, specific dread settle in my stomach, the particular kind reserved for moments when someone is about to say something true about you in front of a room full of people. "About 11 years ago," he began, "Eleanor came to the board with an unusual request." He glanced at me. She'd been offered a retention bonus tied to a supervisor promotion she ultimately declined. Rather than letting the bonus lapse the way company policy required once she turned the promotion down, she asked that the money be redirected into something that would outlast any single paycheck. I remembered writing that letter. I hadn't remembered anyone keeping it. "She called it the Voss Continuity Fund," Richard said, and I heard my own name land oddly in his mouth, formal in a way it never sounded in the break room. Her exact words, from the original letter: "Money spent on one person disappears within a year. Money invested in someone who's already proven they'll show up for others outlives all of us." A hush moved through the ballroom, the kind that precedes a number. "Over 11 years," Richard continued, "through additional company contributions and investment growth, that fund has reached $140,000. A collective gasp rippled outward from the front rows toward the back. I stared at him. I hadn't known the total either. I'd stopped tracking it years ago, the way you stop checking on a tree you planted once you trust it to grow on its own. "The agreement gave Eleanor sole discretion over selecting its first recipient," Richard said, and then he looked past me, toward the woman still holding my hand in the front row. "Marisol Reyes, would you join us?" Marisol's face went through 3 distinct emotions in under 2 seconds: confusion, disbelief, and something that looked almost like fear. "Me?" She mouthed, the same word she'd mouthed from across the room an hour earlier. I nodded and squeezed her hand once before letting go. She stood on legs that clearly weren't fully cooperating and made her way to the stage, where Richard extended an envelope with both hands, the way you'd hand someone something fragile. "On behalf of Whitmore Fabrication," he said, "we're honored to present the first Voss Continuity Award, $140,000, designated for continuing education and community service work." Marisol stared at the envelope like it might dissolve. "I can't accept this," she said, her voice cracking through the microphone. Talia held toward her. "You already have," Richard said gently. She turned to me, eyes streaming now, and asked the only question that mattered. "Why?" I walked to the edge of the stage, close enough that I didn't need the microphone. "Because your mother once ran toward danger instead of away from it, to save my life," I said. "And because for 9 years you've kept showing up the exact same way, for me and for everyone else in your life, without anyone ever asking you to." The ovation that followed lasted, by Priya's later count, almost 2 full minutes. I didn't know yet that 1,100 miles south, on a beach outside a resort with excellent Wi-Fi, my daughter's phone had just started buzzing with a notification from the local news station's app, the kind of push alert that includes a headline and a thumbnail image, in this case a still frame of Marisol's stunned face beside mine, captioned with a number that would look out of context, like something it wasn't. I found out later, from Talia, that the story had already begun circulating before the ceremony even ended. Someone in the audience had live-streamed portions of it on their own account. A local reporter clipped the announcement and posted it with the caption, "Devoted employee's daughter skips her ceremony. Stranger takes her place instead." By 6 o'clock it had been picked up by 2 other outlets. By 8, strangers I would never meet were arguing in comment sections about a family they knew nothing about. I want to be honest about something here, because these stories don't always allow for it. I didn't plan any of this as a public reckoning. I hadn't orchestrated the empty chair or the cameras or the comment sections that would spend the next 3 days dissecting my daughter's character based on 40 seconds of footage. I had simply told the truth, in the moment it was asked of me, and the truth happened to be inconvenient for people who weren't in the room to explain themselves. Claire wasn't cruel by nature. I want that on the record too, even now, even after everything that followed. She'd simply spent years believing there would always be another ceremony, another visit, another version of me that would still be standing there patiently whenever she finally circled back. Most people who neglect the people who love them aren't monsters. They're just gambling on time they don't actually have unlimited access to. Richard found me near the coffee station afterward, 2 cups in hand, his tie already loosened. "You okay?" he asked, handing me one. "I think so," I said. "You've been trying very hard not to think about your phone." I laughed, surprised he'd noticed. "Only to old friends," I said. He smiled and didn't push further, but before he walked away, he asked one more question, quieter this time. "Do you want the communications team to scrub any mention of Claire from the footage before it goes wider?" I thought about that for longer than he probably expected. "No," I finally said. "You sure?" "I don't want anyone attacking her," I said. "But I'm not going to pretend the chair wasn't empty either." He nodded, the way people do when they respect an answer, even if they wouldn't have given the same one themselves. I drove home alone that evening with the Crystal Award wrapped in a hotel napkin on the passenger seat, and I was still 40 minutes from my driveway when my phone lit up for the first time with Claire's name on the screen, the beginning of what would eventually become, by the time I finally pulled in, 61 missed calls I had absolutely no intention of returning that night. I let the phone ring itself out on my kitchen counter for the better part of an hour before I finally picked it up, and by then the number sitting at the top of my notifications read 112. Missed calls, voicemails, stacked one on top of another, like something spilling over a container too small to hold it. Most were from Claire. A handful from Todd. A few from numbers I didn't recognize at all, which I'd later learned belonged to a local reporter, and bizarrely a second cousin I hadn't spoken to since Frank's funeral. I made tea first. I want to be honest about that. I put the kettle on, changed out of the blue dress, hung it carefully in the closet, and only then did I sit down at the kitchen table and call my daughter back, because Frank used to say something to me early in our marriage that I never forgot. Never make a decision or a phone call while you're still standing in the wreckage of the thing that hurt you. Wait until you can see the room clearly. Claire answered before the first ring finished. "Mom." Her voice sounded thin, stretched, like something pulled too tight. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you what?" I said. "The money. $140,000, and you gave it to—" She stopped herself, but I heard the word she swallowed anyway. "I gave it to the person who was in the room," I said. Silence stretched across 1,100 miles. Then Todd's voice, muffled, in the background. "Tell her people online are saying you're a terrible daughter. Tell her that's not fair." And Claire's voice sharpening in response before she came back to me. "This is humiliating, Mom. Do you understand that? People are commenting on the news station's post. They're saying things about me, about Todd." "I didn't post anything," I said. "You didn't have to. You just stood there and let the whole world watch that chair sit empty." I closed my eyes. "Claire, I invited you to a ceremony 6 weeks ago. You said yes. I called to confirm 2 weeks ago. You said yes again. This morning I watched you post a beach photo instead of walking through a hotel lobby. I kept my voice level, the way you keep a hand steady when it wants badly to shake. I didn't embarrass you. You embarrassed yourself, and now you're angry that people noticed. That's not." She stopped, started again. "You could have warned us the money was that big. Would it have changed your decision?" Another silence, longer this time, and in it I heard everything I needed to hear. "We're coming home," she said finally. "Tonight. We already changed the flights." "All right," I said. "Are you angry?" she asked, and her voice cracked slightly on the question, the way it used to when she was 9 years old and had broken something she was afraid to admit to. I thought about that carefully before answering, because I wanted the truth and not the reflex. "No," I said. "I'm disappointed." That's a different thing. Anger burns off. Disappointment settles in and stays. She didn't have a response to that. Todd took the phone before she could find one. "Eleanor," he said, using my first name the way he always did when he wanted to sound reasonable and adult. "I think everyone's overreacting a little here." It was one afternoon. "It was the one afternoon I asked for," I said. "Right, but you have to admit the optics of this whole thing." He stopped himself, perhaps hearing how that sentence was going to land even as it left his mouth. "I just mean, people online don't know the full story. They know the parts that happened," I said. "That's usually enough." He didn't have anything for that either. I heard the phone shift hands again, and Claire's voice returned, quieter now. "We'll be there by 10 tonight." she said. Can we talk? In person? I'll be here, I said, and I meant it more literally than she probably understood. I had, after all, been here, in this house, on this porch, at the end of this phone line, for longer than she'd likely stopped to notice. They arrived at 10:40, headlights sweeping across my living room curtains before the engine even cut off. I watched from the window as Todd climbed out first, moving slower than a man walking toward good news usually moves. Claire followed, and something in the set of her shoulders told me this conversation was not going to be the tearful reconciliation the internet commenters seemed to be expecting from a story like this one. She marched up my porch steps ahead of him, and I opened the door before she could knock. "Mom," she said, without so much as a hello, "we need to talk about what you're going to say to fix this. Not, I'm sorry. Not we should have been there. Fix this," as though the empty chair, and everything that had followed from it, was a problem belonging to me, requiring a solution from me, when I had been the one sitting alone in front of 400 people and 2 TV cameras. I stepped back to let them both inside, and as Todd walked past me into the living room, his eyes went briefly, almost involuntarily, to the small filing cabinet tucked in the corner beside my desk, the same cabinet his own lawyer would ask about 9 days later, once Todd finally understood how much I'd already documented. I didn't notice that glance at the time. I noticed it later, replaying the evening the way you replay a conversation, looking for the exact moment the ground shifted under you. But that night, all I knew was that my daughter had walked into my house asking me to manage her reputation instead of asking whether I was all right, and something in me, quiet, resolved, tired of being patient, finally stopped waiting for her to notice on her own. Claire sat down across from me at the kitchen table without being asked, the way she used to as a teenager when she wanted something and hadn't yet figured out how to word it. Todd stayed standing near the doorway, arms crossed, eyes doing that same quick flick toward the filing cabinet before catching himself. "So," Claire said, "what do we do?" "About what, specifically?" I asked. "About the story. It's everywhere, Mom. People are saying I abandoned you." Her voice had an edge I recognized from years of watching her negotiate with teachers, with landlords, with anyone she believed could be managed if she found the right angle. "You have to post something. Say it was taken out of context." "It wasn't taken out of context," I said. "It happened exactly the way it looked." Her jaw tightened. "You're really not going to help me with this?" "I've been helping you with things for 30 years, I said, and I heard my own voice stay remarkably even, considering I think it might be time I helped myself with something instead. I stood, walked down the hallway to the spare room, and came back carrying 3 storage boxes I'd pulled down from the closet shelf 2 days earlier, not for this conversation specifically, but because something Todd had said on the phone weeks ago about a home equity line had been sitting wrong in my stomach ever since, the way a splinter sits wrong under skin you can't quite reach. "What is this?" Claire asked, eyeing the boxes like they might bite. "Open the first one," I said. She lifted the lid slowly. Inside sat folders, bank statements, a stack of documents I'd requested from my mortgage company after 3 sleepless nights of quiet, methodical worry. She pulled out the top folder and went very still. "This is the equity line on the house," she said. "Yes," I said. "The one that was opened 4 months ago. The one with my signature on it." Her eyes came up to meet mine, and for the first time all evening, I saw something other than defensiveness cross her face. Fear, maybe. Or recognition. "I never signed that," I said quietly. "I called the bank on Tuesday to ask why I hadn't received a statement in months, because I'd noticed a strange auto payment coming out of my checking account. They read me the loan details over the phone. $42,000, drawn against this house, opened in March." I slid a second folder across the table. I had a notary compare the signature on that application to 3 documents I signed the same month: my tax return, a prescription pickup form, and my card at the bank itself. Todd hadn't moved from the doorway, but something in his posture had changed, gone rigid in a way that told me he already knew exactly where this was going. "They don't match," I said. "Not close. Whoever signed that loan application traced my name from something, badly." The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened in my kitchen in years. "Mom," Claire said, and her voice had lost its edge entirely now, gone thin and young. "I didn't. I'm not asking you," I said, and turned, for the first time all night, to look directly at Todd. "I'm asking him." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "It was supposed to be temporary," he finally said. "A bridge loan. The business needed capital, and the bank wouldn't approve it under just our names because of the— He stopped. Because of your credit, I said. So you used mine. Without asking. I was going to tell you, he said. Once things stabilized. Once you'd drawn down $42,000 against a house I paid off 11 years ago. I said, using a signature you forged, and you were going to tell me. Claire had gone pale, staring at Todd like she was seeing him from a distance for the first time. You told me your parents lent us that money, she said quietly. You said your dad co-signed something? Claire, you lied to me too. I didn't raise my voice. I want that understood clearly, because I know how these moments are supposed to escalate in the stories people tell about betrayal. Shouting, thrown objects, doors slammed hard enough to rattle windows. That's not what happened in my kitchen that night. What happened was quieter, and in its own way, more final. I simply laid a third folder on the table, this one containing a letter from my attorney, drafted 2 days earlier outlining exactly 3 options: full repayment on a documented schedule, voluntary disclosure to the bank's fraud department with restitution attached, or a formal police report. You have until Friday to choose one, I said. I'd suggest talking to a lawyer of your own before you decide. You're really going to do this, Todd said, something between disbelief and anger creeping into his voice. Over one loan. I'm doing this, I said, because you decided my name was available for you to use without asking, the same way my daughter decided my time was available to skip without asking. I've spent a long time being generous with things people assumed I'd never notice going missing. I closed the folder gently, the way you close something you don't intend to reopen in anger. I noticed Claire didn't defend him. That, more than anything else that happened that night, told me something had genuinely shifted. She sat very still, staring at the folder, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of its earlier sharpness left in it at all. What happens now? She asked. That depends entirely on what he decides by Friday, I said, and on what you decide to do about the fact that he's been lying to both of us. Todd left first, the front door closing harder than it needed to, though not quite a slam. Claire lingered in the doorway for a long moment, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was small enough to still believe I could fix anything that frightened her. I didn't know, she said. I believe that, I said. I'm not sure it changes very much. She left without another word, and I sat alone at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, the 3 folders still spread out in front of me, feeling far less triumphant than I'd expected to feel, and far more tired than I had any right to be after finally saying the thing I'd been carrying quietly for weeks. Todd chose voluntary disclosure. His lawyer called mine 9 days later, which apparently counts as fast in matters like these, though it didn't feel fast sitting on my end of it. The bank's fraud department opened a formal review, and I was told gently, by an investigator who'd clearly delivered this same speech to 100 other people in 100 other kitchens, that a case like this typically takes 3 to 6 months to resolve fully between document verification, restitution scheduling, and the bank deciding whether to pursue charges or accept a negotiated repayment plan instead. 6 months. I remember sitting with that number for a long while after I hung up the phone, understanding for the first time that justice, the real kind, doesn't arrive with the tidy speed of a courtroom drama. It arrives in increments, paperwork, waiting rooms, and a great deal of silence in between. Todd and Claire separated in April, not dramatically, not with the kind of scene the internet had been hoping for since the story first broke, but quietly the way most marriages actually end. A lease signed on a smaller apartment, furniture divided over a series of awkward weekend visits, a silence between 2 people who'd once believed they'd built something sturdier than it turned out to be. I didn't ask for details. Claire offered a few anyway, in the flat, exhausted voice of someone still sorting through wreckage. He kept saying it was temporary. She told me one afternoon in May, sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. Everything was always temporary with him. The loan, the excuses, the trip we took instead of coming to your ceremony. She looked out at the yard for a long moment. I think I knew something was wrong for longer than I let myself admit. I didn't tell her I'd suspected the same thing about her marriage for over a year. Some truths don't need saying twice. I changed the locks on my house in February, not out of fear exactly, but because I'd learned something uncomfortable about how easily a signature can be borrowed by someone who's decided you'll never check. I also called my attorney and updated my will, not to cut Claire out, though I know that's the ending some people reading this might expect, and maybe even want. I restructured it instead, so that whatever comes to her someday comes with protections neither she nor anyone married into this family can quietly draw against without my knowledge. Love doesn't require blind trust. I learned that lesson late, but I learned it. Marisol used a portion of the continuity fund to finish a graduate certification in geriatric rehabilitation she'd been putting off for 3 years, and the rest she quietly redirected into a small scholarship for community college students studying physical therapy. Students, she told me, who remind her of herself at 20, waiting tables and hoping nobody noticed how thin the margins were. She never once suggested I should have given the money to Claire instead. She never brought up Claire at all, actually, which I've come to understand as its own small kindness. Claire and I talk now, most weeks, though differently than before. She calls sometimes just to ask how I'm doing and stays on the phone past the 4-minute mark, and I've noticed she no longer treats a visit like an obligation squeezed between other things. 2 Sundays ago she came by with takeout, and we sat on the porch until it got dark, not talking about Todd or the loan or any of it, just talking, the way people do when they're relearning how to simply be in a room together. I won't tell you it's fully healed, because it isn't, and I've grown suspicious of any story that claims it can be. Trust doesn't rebuild on the same schedule as an apology. It rebuilds slowly in small consistent Tuesdays, the kind nobody photographs or writes news stories about. What I know now, 35 years into a career nobody expected to end with cameras in the room, is this: showing up isn't a debt anyone owes you because you share their blood. It's a choice people make, over and over, the way Rosa chose it for 22 years, the way Marisol chooses it still. I spent a long time confusing patience with permission, letting the people closest to me assume I'd always be standing there, unchanged, unbothered, however long they took to notice me. I'm still standing here. I just changed the locks. If any part of this reminded you of someone in your own life, a person you keep waiting on, a boundary you keep meaning to draw and never quite do, I hope you'll take it as permission to notice sooner than I did. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. If it meant something to you, stay a while longer, and I'll see you in the next story.